But the auction, this odd, intriguing event, had the potential to change everything. For the first time in years, Parker felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. What would it be like to meet someone who wasn't interested in his money, who wasn't looking for the next lavish gift or designer dress? What if he could find someone who saw him for who he truly was, beyond the titles, the wealth, the public image? There was one woman in particular who had caught his attention. She hadn't been among the typical socialites and elite profiles that usually showed up at these auctions. Her name was Olivia Turner. The description next to her photo had been sparse, but there was something about the way her eyes had looked out from the photograph, something that felt real, something that made him want to know her. She wasn't polished. She didn't fit the mold of the women who usually accompanied him to events. And yet her image lingered in his mind longer than it should have. What could she possibly want with a man like him? He couldn't imagine her fitting into his world, and yet the thought of meeting her, of seeing her in person, sent a ripple of excitement through him that he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair again, the city lights flickering outside. The familiar loneliness settled over him like a heavy blanket, but this time it felt different. Maybe it was time to break free. Maybe it was time to let someone in. The auction was in 3 days, and for the first time in a long while, Parker Montgomery felt alive. Olivia Turner adjusted her coat as she hurried down the crowded streets of Brooklyn, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The air was brisk, sharp with the promise of winter, but she hardly noticed the chill as she hurried to the subway. Her son Marcus was already at home waiting for her, his small face lighting up whenever she walked through the door. It was her favorite part of the day, his innocent joy, his bright eyes, the way he ran to her with arms wide open as if she were the most important person in the world. It wasn't easy, though. Nothing in Olivia's life ever was. Single motherhood had never been a fairy tale, and neither had her struggle to keep her family afloat. Bills piled up, her freelance work was sporadic, and dreams of a better life for her children often felt like fragile illusions. But she'd never stopped fighting. For Marcus. For little Sophia, too, though her daughter was still too young to understand the weight Olivia carried on her shoulders. She glanced down at her phone as it buzzed again. Another email from a potential client who was pushing back on their agreement. "We need to adjust the pricing," it read. "Not enough work delivered yet." Olivia sighed, rubbing her temples as the pressure built up. Always the same dance, she thought. Always working harder than she was paid for, constantly juggling the demands of motherhood and a career that barely kept them from slipping into debt. The subway station was packed, but Olivia found her place by the doors, leaning against the cold metal as the train rumbled to life. She closed her eyes for a moment, lost in her thoughts, but they were quickly interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing again. It was Lisa. "Are you sure about this?" The text was brief, but the weight of Lisa's concern came through clearly. Olivia had told her friend about the invitation to the charity auction, but she had been reluctant to accept. Lisa, with her well-meaning but often overbearing advice, had been pushing her to go for weeks. "You deserve something good, Liv," she'd told her. "This could be your chance. Think about Marcus and Sophia's future." Olivia had been trying to ignore the tug of the invitation, trying to convince herself it was ridiculous, a mistake. She wasn't some trophy to be bid on. She wasn't some prize to be won by the highest bidder, no matter how rich they were. But when she thought about her children, about the life she could give them if only she could escape this constant struggle, there was a temptation she couldn't ignore. The money the auction promised would go a long way in securing their future. It could open doors for Marcus to go to a good school, help Sophia grow up without the same financial anxieties she had known. But the price, the auction itself, the thought of putting herself in a position where she could be bought like a commodity, made her skin crawl. She wasn't naive enough to believe it was anything but transactional. The idea that some wealthy man would win the chance to have her as a companion, even for a year, felt demeaning. Yet it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her children. It was about survival. But the auction, this odd, intriguing event, had the potential to change everything. For the first time in years, Parker felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. What would it be like to meet someone who wasn't interested in his money, who wasn't looking for the next lavish gift or designer dress? What if he could find someone who saw him for who he truly was, beyond the titles, the wealth, the public image? There was one woman in particular who had caught his attention. She hadn't been among the typical socialites and elite profiles that usually showed up at these auctions. Her name was Olivia Turner. The description next to her photo had been sparse, but there was something about the way her eyes had looked out from the photograph, something that felt real, something that made him want to know her. She wasn't polished. She didn't fit the mold of the women who usually accompanied him to events. And yet, her image lingered in his mind longer than it should have. What could she possibly want with a man like him? He couldn't imagine her fitting into his world, and yet the thought of meeting her, of seeing her in person, sent a ripple of excitement through him that he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair again, the city lights flickering outside. The familiar loneliness settled over him like a heavy blanket. But this time, it felt different. Maybe it was time to break free. Maybe it was time to let someone in. The auction was in 3 days, and for the first time in a long while, Parker Montgomery felt alive. Olivia Turner adjusted her coat as she hurried down the crowded streets of Brooklyn, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The air was brisk, sharp with the promise of winter, but she hardly noticed the chill as she hurried to the subway. Her son, Marcus, was already at home waiting for her, his small face lighting up whenever she walked through the door. It was her favorite part of the day, his innocent joy, his bright eyes, the way he ran to her with arms wide open, as if she were the most important person in the world. It wasn't easy, though. Nothing in Olivia's life ever was. Single motherhood had never been a fairy tale, and neither had her struggle to keep her family afloat. Bills piled up, her freelance work was sporadic, and dreams of a better life for her children often felt like fragile illusions. But she'd never stopped fighting. For Marcus. For little Sophia, too, though her daughter was still too young to understand the weight Olivia carried on her shoulders. She glanced down at her phone as it buzzed again. Another email from a potential client who was pushing back on their agreement. "We need to adjust the pricing," it read. Not enough work delivered yet. Olivia sighed, rubbing her temples as the pressure built up. Always the same dance, she thought. Always working harder than she was paid for, constantly juggling the demands of motherhood and a career that barely kept them from slipping into debt. The subway station was packed, but Olivia found her place by the doors, leaning against the cold metal as the train rumbled to life. She closed her eyes for a moment, lost in her thoughts, but they were quickly interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing again. It was Lisa. "Are you sure about this?" The text was brief, but the weight of Lisa's concern came through clearly. Olivia had told her friend about the invitation to the charity auction, but she had been reluctant to accept. Lisa, with her well-meaning but often overbearing advice, had been pushing her to go for weeks. "You deserve something good, Liv," she'd told her. "This could be your chance. Think about Marcus and Sophia's future." Olivia had been trying to ignore the tug of the invitation, trying to convince herself it was ridiculous, a mistake. She wasn't some trophy to be bid on. She wasn't some prize to be won by the highest bidder, no matter how rich they were. But when she thought about her children, about the life she could give them if only she could escape this constant struggle, there was a temptation she couldn't ignore. The money the auction promised would go a long way in securing their future, It could open doors for Marcus to go to a good school, help Sophia grow up without the same financial anxieties she had known. But the price, the auction itself, the thought of putting herself in a position where she could be bought like a commodity, made her skin crawl. She wasn't naive enough to believe it was anything but transactional. The idea that some wealthy man would win the chance to have her as a companion, even for a year, felt demeaning. Yet, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her children. It was about survival. Olivia's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began typing a reply to Lisa. "I don't know, Elle. Maybe I need the money, but it feels wrong." What kind of man does that? Bids for someone's time? She paused before sending the message. But then she added, "Maybe I'll go, just to see what it's about." She hit send, slipping her phone back into her bag just as the train pulled into the station. She stepped out into the cold night, the weight of her decision settling deeper in her chest. At the same time, across the city in his penthouse, Parker Montgomery was staring at his phone once more, waiting for the clock to tick down on the auction. He had been checking the event details obsessively, looking through the profiles of each woman available for bid, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this felt off. It wasn't the idea of paying for someone's company that bothered him. It was the idea of using his wealth to control another person's time. He had spent years building his empire, learning that power and control were essential to survival in his world. It was how he had maintained his position at the top of his industry. But now, with the bidding event looming, he found himself questioning the very thing that had defined his life. The more he thought about it, the more the idea of companionship seemed hollow. He wasn't looking for another empty evening with a beautiful woman who only wanted his money. He had experienced enough of that to last several lifetimes. And then there was Olivia. Her profile had caught his eye like no one else's. The photo was simple, just a woman standing on a street corner looking straight into the camera with an expression that was both warm and cautious. There was something about her, her eyes, something real. He felt it instantly. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't, and as much as he tried to rationalize it, the more he was drawn to her. Parker had been warned by his inner circle not to take part in something so unconventional. Ethan had been the first to tell him it was a bad idea. "You've got your pick of women. Why settle for this? It's not your usual style." But it was her face, her vulnerability that had lingered in his mind. He could feel his pulse quicken as the countdown to the auction began. His mind flashed to the moment when he would place his bid. But what would happen after that? Would it be just another fleeting encounter, another piece of his life he could throw away once it no longer entertained him? The thought unsettled him. Olivia Turner had somehow come to mean more to him than he was prepared to admit. Just as the thought passed, his phone buzzed again. It was a reminder. The auction starts in 10 minutes. Parker closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. In the silence of his penthouse, he realized something that both startled and excited him. This auction, this event, was not just about buying someone's time. It was about breaking free from the life he had built. For once, he was stepping into the unknown. With one final deliberate breath, he pressed "Join Auction." As Olivia entered the large, glitzy ballroom of the charity event later that evening, the weight of her decision hit her in full force. The room was filled with beautifully dressed women and impeccably suited men, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation, a sharp contrast to the thoughts swirling in her head. She scanned the room, feeling out of place in her simple, elegant dress. She had prepared herself for this moment, for the surreal experience of standing in front of a room of wealthy strangers waiting to be bought, but still, it felt wrong. And yet, here she was. Her heart pounded as she saw the names of the bidders scrolling across the screen at the front of the room. And somewhere in the crowd, Parker Montgomery watched her. The auction was about to begin. The ballroom was a blur of light and laughter, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation fading into the background as Olivia stood at the front of the room, her palms clammy against the soft fabric of her dress. She hadn't expected the auction to feel so surreal. In the city's most luxurious venue, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and the soft shimmer of expensive gowns, Olivia felt the weight of the decision she had made pressing heavily on her chest. She had tried to stay detached, telling herself that this was just business. But every second that passed in the opulent ballroom, with the eyes of the room flicking over her as though she were a piece of artwork to be evaluated, made her question everything. She wasn't here to flirt or charm. She was here for a year of her life to be bought. Her time, her presence, everything that made her who she was, auctioned off to the highest bidder. The fact that she wasn't the only woman standing at the front of the room didn't make her feel any less exposed. All around her were women, some older, some younger, but all beautiful in their own right. Their expressions varied. Some were eager, others nervous, but all of them seemed more prepared for this than Olivia ever would be. She could hear the soft murmurs of approval from the crowd as men passed by, their gaze sweeping over the women as though sizing up property. But Olivia wasn't property. And yet, here she was. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as she glanced around the room, catching sight of the other women's subtle smiles and knowing glances, as though they had long since resigned themselves to the strange nature of the night. But Olivia hadn't. She was here out of necessity, driven by the thought of securing a future for her children, of escaping the exhausting cycle of poverty that had shackled her for so long. A voice beside her jolted her from her thoughts. "You're new to this, aren't you?" Olivia turned to find a woman standing next to her, tall and regal in an emerald gown. She had the air of someone who was completely comfortable in this world, her perfectly manicured hand resting on a champagne flute. "Excuse me?" Olivia asked, trying to mask her discomfort. The woman smiled knowingly, her eyes flicking up and down Olivia's figure. "You don't have the look of someone who does this often. You seem uncertain." Olivia's heart raced. She was aware of how out of place she must look, how much she didn't belong here. But this woman wasn't being cruel. Instead, she offered a sympathetic smile, almost like a silent acknowledgement of the awkwardness Olivia felt. "It's all right, honey," the woman continued. "I know it's a little strange the first time, but you get used to it. We all do in the end." Olivia tried to force a smile but felt the sting of judgment creep into her chest. The woman wasn't wrong. This was a world she didn't understand, but was forced to enter. She wasn't like the other women in this room, wasn't used to posing for the highest bidder or wearing a mask of confidence to hide her nerves. Before she could respond, the auctioneer took his place at the podium, and the room grew quiet. The man was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his demeanor polished and practiced as he raised a hand to command attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice rang out, smooth and authoritative. "Welcome to the charity auction. Tonight, we are raising funds for a cause dear to all of us, giving back to communities in need. But more importantly, we are offering you a rare opportunity to experience something you can't find anywhere else. The chance to spend a year with one of the incredible women here tonight and make a lasting impact on their lives as they do on yours." A ripple of applause spread through the room. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, her stomach knotting in response to the realization that in just a few minutes she would be up for bid. And the moment she stepped into the spotlight, she would cease to be a person. She would become a commodity, a prize. But when she looked up again, her eyes locked with a man sitting at the far end of the ballroom, a tall, imposing figure whose sharp features were partially hidden in the shadows. His posture was relaxed, but exuded quiet power, his gaze unwavering as it seemed to seek something or someone across the room. For a moment their eyes met, and Olivia felt a strange rush of heat. It wasn't the typical kind of interest she was used to from men, nothing shallow or predatory. It was something deeper, more intense, as though he could see beyond the surface of her discomfort, her uncertainty, into something else entirely. She quickly looked away, hoping it had just been a trick of the light, a flicker of imagination. But when the auctioneer's voice cut through the air again, announcing the first bid, she found herself searching the crowd once more, her pulse quickening at the thought of that gaze on her. The auction proceeded, with each woman standing at the front, one by one, and then the bidding began. Olivia stood frozen in place, each moment seeming to stretch into eternity. She wasn't nervous about the auction itself, not anymore. It was the anticipation, the idea that someone would win her time, her company, and that decision would change everything. The prices soared higher as each bid was placed, but still, none of it felt real to her, not in the way it should. Then, as the auctioneer's voice took on a finality, Olivia was called. "Next, we have Olivia Turner," the auctioneer announced. "A woman of strength, grace, and resilience, a mother who has dedicated her life to her family, and now, for one lucky man, she offers the chance to spend a year getting to know her. What do we have to start the bidding?" Olivia felt her heart race as the room's attention turned toward her. She could feel the heat of their gazes, the whispering conversations behind her. She glanced toward the crowd and caught sight of Parker again. This time, he wasn't looking at her from the shadows. His eyes were focused entirely on her, and then a voice broke through the silence. $1 million. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration that caught everyone off guard. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the bid. Parker Montgomery, the man who had seemed to loom in the background of her thoughts, now taking center stage in her life in the most unexpected way. A bid from him, of that size, was more than just a purchase. It was a statement. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium with a sharp, commanding thunk, and the crowd erupted into applause. The room, filled with murmurs of excitement, seemed to sway with the tension that had built since the announcement. But Olivia Turner could hardly hear the applause. The words, $1 million, still echoed in her mind as she stood frozen, her body rigid as though the air had thickened around her. Parker Montgomery had just bought her, a year of her time, her presence, everything she had to offer for the sum of $1 million. $1 million. The number seemed impossible to comprehend. She had heard the rumors about the billionaire tech mogul who played by his own rules, who used his wealth to control the world around him. But hearing it was one thing. Seeing it unfold before her was another entirely. She felt like a prize on display, an object to be owned, and yet something in her stirred, an undeniable tension that she couldn't ignore. She had been bought, and while part of her bristled against that fact, another part of her was intrigued. He had looked at her with those intense eyes. He had seen her. His bid had been decisive, almost forceful, as if he had made up his mind in that instant. Olivia's fingers tightened around the delicate strap of her purse. She glanced at Lisa, who stood at the back of the room, her wide eyes filled with concern. Olivia could feel the weight of Lisa's silent judgment, but more than that, she felt the weight of her own doubt pressing down on her. She had agreed to this, to the auction, to this arrangement, because she needed the money. She needed the chance to secure her children's future. But standing here now, facing Parker Montgomery, she wondered if she had made a mistake. This wasn't just some business deal. She wasn't sure what it was, but it felt more complicated than she had ever imagined. The applause slowly faded as the crowd began to disperse, but Parker remained seated at his table, watching her intently. Olivia's heart raced. She tried to ignore the flutter in her stomach, the awareness that, for better or worse, her life was about to change. It wasn't just the price. It was the man himself. Parker Montgomery was the embodiment of everything she had come to fear about wealth and power, detached, cold, and impossible to read. And yet, he had bid on her. Her. "Olivia Turner," a voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find the auctioneer smiling politely at her. "Your bidder has been confirmed. Mr. Montgomery would like to speak with you privately." She forced a tight smile. "Of course." Her legs felt unsteady as she made her way toward the table where Parker sat. He stood when she approached, his tall figure towering over her. His tailored suit seemed designed to make him appear even more imposing, sharp, refined, almost untouchable. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment they lingered, that silent communication between them both clear and unsettling. "Ms. Turner," he said, his voice low and measured. "Thank you for agreeing to this." She nodded stiffly, trying to hide the unease flooding her chest. "Thank you for your generosity." The word felt strange on her tongue. Generosity. Was that what this was? Or was this some twisted game to him? She had no idea, and the more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. She had spent years building her life around her children, her work, her values. She had always been the one to make the hard choices, but never had she felt so exposed. "You're wondering why I bid on you," he said, as if reading her thoughts. His gaze remained steady, but there was an unfamiliar flicker in his eyes, something that gave her pause. "I'm not looking for a trophy or a pretty face to accompany me to galas." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you looking for?" Parker took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I'm looking for something real," he said quietly. "I don't want another empty relationship. I'm not here for someone who sees me as a means to an end or a connection to my wealth. I don't need that. I need honesty." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and vulnerable, and Olivia wasn't sure what to do with them. Was this just more manipulation, or was he being sincere? She had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. "Honesty?" she repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "You don't think buying a person's time for a year is the opposite of honesty?" He didn't flinch at her sharp tone, instead stepping back and motioning for her to sit beside him at the table. "I'm not asking for anything beyond your presence. I know this is unconventional, but I don't know how else to explain it." He leaned forward, his voice softening. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than yourself, Olivia." Her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so long in her own head, her own world, that hearing someone speak to her like this, like she was worth more than just what she could provide financially, was foreign. It felt almost too good to be true. She sat down across from him, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. "I didn't come here for this," she finally said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I came here because my children need a future, and I need to make sure I can give that to them. But this—" She gestured between them, the tension palpable. "I don't know if I can just let go of everything I know." Parker studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "I understand. You don't have to let go of anything. But you should know that I'm not going to make you pretend to be something you're not. This arrangement isn't about me controlling you. It's about time and space, and if that means building something real, then so be it." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he wasn't just another man using his wealth to buy her compliance, her silence, her time. But the reality of it was too complicated. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself in a situation like this? "I'll give you the time you agreed to," she said finally, standing up to leave. "But just so we're clear, I'm not here to fall in line, Parker. I'm here because I need to be, and nothing more." He stood too, his tall frame imposing but not threatening. "Fair enough," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "But I hope that, in time, you'll see there's more than just business here." And as Olivia turned away, she wasn't sure whether she was relieved or terrified. The next few days after the auction were a blur of emotions for Olivia. She'd agreed to the arrangement, yes, she'd allowed herself to be bought. But now that the decision had been made, the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. Every time she passed her children's rooms, every time Marcus looked up at her with those trusting eyes, she felt the tug of guilt. Was this really the right choice? What had she signed up for beyond the money? Parker's words echoed in her mind. "I'm not asking for you to be anything other than yourself." But was she really being herself? Or had she become something else? A woman defined by the wealth of the man who had just won her. Was this still her choice? Or was she just doing what needed to be done for the sake of her children? She could no longer convince herself that she was simply playing a role. Being with Parker Montgomery, even if it was for a year, was already beginning to feel like something else entirely, and that terrified her. The first official meeting after the auction came sooner than she had expected. Parker had arranged for a dinner at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, a place so fancy that Olivia felt almost out of place walking through its polished marble doors. The waiter led them to a private corner, away from prying eyes. But even then, Olivia couldn't escape the sensation that everyone was watching. The other patrons, the well-dressed servers, even the quiet hum of the ambient music, it all seemed like part of a show she wasn't meant to be a part of. Parker was already seated, his back straight, his jaw sharp, and his eyes focused on a glass of whiskey that was half empty. He looked every inch the billionaire, refined, in control, a man accustomed to making decisions that shaped the world around him. He stood as she approached, his smile polite but distant, his gaze lingering for just a second too long before he gestured for her to sit. "Olivia," he greeted, his deep voice carrying a coolness that matched the ambiance of the restaurant. "I'm glad you could make it." She smiled, though it felt a little strained. "Of course. Thank you for the invitation." The moment she sat down, the waiter appeared, offering a menu that seemed impossibly large and filled with dishes she could barely pronounce. She glanced over at Parker, whose attention was focused entirely on her. Something about the way he studied her, his eyes appraising every movement, made her feel exposed. But this wasn't the kind of exposure she had expected. This was different. "How was your day?" Parker asked, his tone casual, but there was a sharpness to it, like he was testing her, as if every word mattered. Olivia set the menu down, feeling a sudden need to break the ice. "Same as usual," she said, her voice light, though she could feel her heart thudding in her chest. "Kids to school, deadlines to meet, bills to pay. You know, the usual grind." Parker tilted his head slightly, as if considering her answer. "And how are you handling it all?" he asked, his gaze softening for a moment before returning to its usual intensity. "The pressure, the responsibilities. Are you managing?" Olivia hesitated. Her life had always been about managing, always about juggling the endless weight of motherhood and work. She had gotten good at it, but that didn't mean it was easy. "I manage," she said finally, her voice tight. "That's all anyone like me can do, right?" Parker's eyes shifted, though she couldn't quite read what was there. "I suppose," he said, his voice quiet. But sometimes, Olivia, it's okay to stop managing and start living. She blinked, taken aback by his words. Living, the idea felt almost foreign. For so long, she had been just surviving. Living had always seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. The waiter arrived to take their orders, and for a moment, Olivia's attention was diverted. When she glanced back up, Parker had already turned his attention to his drink again, the mask of control slipping back into place. A flash of tension passed through the air between them, and Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this whole evening had been set up with an agenda she didn't fully understand. The evening wore on, the conversation becoming more strained as they moved through the meal. Olivia found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable, not just with the setting or the food, but with Parker himself. Despite the wealth and refinement, something about him felt inaccessible, like a man who had so much, but still couldn't connect with anyone. His quiet, calculating demeanor sent a shiver through her. It was as if he was observing her every move, trying to figure her out. And the more he did, the more she felt the walls closing in. Finally, as dessert was placed before them, Olivia set her fork down and leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. "Parker," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "I'm here because you asked me to be. But I need to be clear about something. This arrangement, this year of companionship, it's not easy for me. It's not easy for anyone, I imagine. And I need to know what your expectations are." Parker's eyes met hers again, this time without the cool detachment. There was something like understanding in his gaze, but it wasn't enough to erase the tension between them. He set his glass down and leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "My expectations?" he asked softly. "I'm not looking for anything conventional. I'm not asking for a fairy tale, Olivia. But I do want to understand you. I don't want this to be a transaction. I know that's what it looks like, but it doesn't have to be that way." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. He was offering her something real. But could she trust it? Or was he just trying to soften the edges of a deal that had been sealed with money? "Then what are you asking for?" Olivia pressed, her voice trembling despite herself. "What do you want from me, Parker?" For a moment he didn't answer. His gaze softened, the familiar walls slipping away just slightly. "I want you to trust me," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. "That's all." And just like that, Olivia realized, the hardest part wasn't going to be living up to his expectations. The hardest part was going to be trusting him. The days following the dinner with Parker passed in a blur. Olivia spent her time juggling her freelance work and the demands of motherhood, trying to ignore the pull of the promise Parker had made, the promise that this year wouldn't just be a business transaction, that it could be something more. But every time she tried to relax, every time she attempted to convince herself that maybe this arrangement would be just as he said, her doubts crept in. She couldn't ignore the feeling of being bought. The way Parker had bid on her, like she was a rare piece of art or an investment, still gnawed at her. Despite his words, despite the quiet sincerity in his voice, Olivia couldn't shake the discomfort of being part of a transaction that felt more like an experiment than a real relationship. The stress from the past few weeks began to take its toll. Every day was a delicate balancing act, trying to keep her children's lives stable, maintaining her own work, and, now, dealing with the growing emotional complexity of this arrangement with Parker. She couldn't get him out of her mind, but she wasn't sure if it was because of his charm, his wealth, or the strange way he had captured her attention. It was a late afternoon when the phone call came. Olivia was at home, sitting at the kitchen table with papers scattered in front of her, trying to meet an impending deadline. The sound of her phone ringing broke the silence, and she glanced down to see Parker's name flashing on the screen. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon after their dinner. With a reluctant sigh, she answered, "Hello?" "Olivia." His voice came through, smooth and calm as always, but there was an edge to it that she couldn't quite place. "I need to speak with you about something important. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning?" Olivia sat up straight, her fingers tightening around the phone. "What's this about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about the business deal I mentioned," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "The one that could change everything for you. For us, if you want it." Her heart skipped a beat. For us. It was a casual statement, but there was something in the way he said it. An underlying promise, a suggestion of something deeper. "I don't understand," Olivia said, her throat dry. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "I'll explain everything when you get here," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I think it's time we discuss your future and what that might look like outside of our arrangement." Olivia paused, then nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. Tomorrow morning, then." The call ended, and Olivia sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Her future. What did that mean? And what did Parker mean by our arrangement? She wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but the mention of her future, her children's future, stirred something deep inside her. Could this be the opportunity she had been hoping for? The one thing that could secure a better life for her family? The next morning she stood in the sleek lobby of Parker's company building, waiting for the elevator to take her up to his floor. The walls were glass and polished metal, reflecting the ambition of the city's elite. She was dressed simply, her usual blazer and dark jeans, but even in this casual outfit, she felt like a fish out of water. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride was brief, but it felt like the longest minute of her life. The doors opened with a soft ding, and she stepped into a hallway that seemed too quiet for the sprawling corporate empire Parker had built. The office was larger than she had imagined, glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the city below. The view was breathtaking, but it also made her feel small, insignificant. A single chair sat in front of a sleek desk, and behind it stood Parker, his back to her, as he stared out at the city. "You made it," he said, his voice softer than it had been over the phone. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "Of course," Olivia replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "What's going on, Parker?" He motioned for her to sit, and she did, feeling the weight of his gaze on her the entire time. He took a seat across from her, his posture straight, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. It wasn't the usual calculation she had grown accustomed to. This time, there was something deeper, more personal. "I've been thinking," he began, his hands clasped together, "about this whole arrangement we have. I know I promised you it wouldn't be transactional. But I'm starting to realize that even though I can offer you money, connections, security, it's not enough. I can't fix everything, Olivia." Her heart skipped a beat at the vulnerability in his voice, and she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crack. "What are you saying?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. "I know you didn't agree to this because you wanted my charity. You agreed because you needed something real, and I want to offer that, not just for you, but for your children. If you want to take that step, there's something I can help you with, something that could give you the financial freedom to build the future you've dreamed of." Olivia's mind raced. What was he offering? She had no idea, but the weight of the decision hung heavy on her chest. Was this another opportunity to escape the suffocating grip of financial insecurity, or was it simply another way for him to use his power? "Parker, what are you asking me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was something else, something almost gentle. "I'm offering you the chance to start a business, a real one that could make a difference for you and your family." Olivia blinked, her breath catching. "A business?" "Yes, a venture that I'll help you launch. You'll have everything you need to succeed, but it'll be yours, Olivia. You'll be in control." The idea was almost too much to grasp. A business, her own future. She could see it, almost feel it in her hands, but the reality of it all seemed too distant, too surreal. "What's the catch?" she asked, trying to keep her emotions in check. Parker leaned back, his eyes steady on hers. "No catch. You'll work for it, of course, but you'll never have to rely on anyone again. Not even me." For the first time since meeting him, Olivia felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. But it came with a price. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself to walk into this unknown with the weight of her family's future resting on her decisions? The weight of Parker's offer lingered in Olivia's mind long after she left his office that afternoon. She hadn't expected such a proposition, a business of her own with his backing. It was almost too perfect, too tempting to dismiss. But the more she thought about it, the more the familiar pangs of doubt crept in. She'd been burned before, by promises that never materialized, by people who told her they wanted to help but only expected something in return. And while Parker seemed different, his wealth and power hovered over their interactions like an unspoken truth. She couldn't ignore the dynamic between them. No matter how genuine his offer seemed, she couldn't forget that this was all rooted in a contract, a year-long arrangement where she was being paid for her time. Her children had been the primary reason she'd agreed to this, but now a new, more complicated question loomed. Was she doing this for them, or was she simply trading one form of dependency for another? The next morning, Olivia found herself in her small Brooklyn apartment, pacing back and forth as Marcus and Sophia played in the living room. They were still too young to understand what was happening, but Olivia knew that her choices would shape their lives. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time to leave for the meeting with Parker's team. He had insisted she come to his office today to meet with a few people who would help guide her through the process of starting her business. The prospect was overwhelming, but the idea of financial independence, of carving out a future where she could provide for her children without relying on anyone else, was almost too enticing to ignore. Still, something tugged at her. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something deeper, a hesitation she couldn't quite name. She'd been through enough in her life to know that nothing came without strings attached. And though Parker seemed genuine in his offer, she couldn't forget how little she knew about him, about his true motivations. But when she thought about her kids, about the future she could build for them, the choice felt clearer. She had to at least take the next step. She couldn't afford to stand still. With a deep breath, Olivia left her apartment, her mind still churning with uncertainty. The sleek elevator doors opened, and Olivia stepped into the high-rise building with the same feeling of unease she had felt on her previous visit. But today she tried to push the discomfort aside. This was for her children. This was for them. She reached Parker's office suite, and the receptionist greeted her warmly. "Mr. Montgomery is expecting you," she said, her smile professional, but Olivia could detect the subtle hint of awe in the woman's voice. As Olivia followed the receptionist down the corridor, she couldn't help but feel out of place. The pristine offices, the polished floors, the quiet hum of conversation behind closed doors, it all felt like a world she could never truly belong to. But she had to try. For Marcus. For Sophia. When they reached the conference room, Parker was already there, standing by the window with his back to her. He turned as she entered, offering a warm smile. But as always, There was something distant in his eyes, a mask he wore that made it hard to read him. "Olivia," he greeted her, his voice calm and measured. "I'm glad you could make it today." She nodded, taking a seat across from him. As usual, he looked every bit the polished billionaire, impeccably dressed, every detail in place. But beneath the surface, she saw the familiar tension in his posture, like a man constantly calculating, always in control, always on guard. It reminded her of the walls she'd built around herself, the walls she'd learned to rely on for protection. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle for someone who had so much control over every situation. Olivia hesitated, meeting his gaze. "Honestly?" she began, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm not sure. This is a huge step, a business, my own business. It's hard to wrap my head around it." Parker studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It's a lot to take in, I know, but you've already proven that you can handle a great deal more than most people ever will." His gaze softened, just slightly, as if acknowledging the challenges she faced. "I wouldn't offer this if I didn't believe in you." Olivia swallowed, the weight of his words settling over her. "He believes in me." The idea felt strange. No one had ever said that to her, certainly not someone like him. "Let me introduce you to my team," Parker continued, standing and motioning toward the door. As the door opened, two people stepped inside, both in business attire, both looking confident and assured. "This is Clara," he said, gesturing to a woman in her late 30s with short dark hair and glasses. "And this is Jack," he added, nodding toward a tall man with a serious expression. "They'll be working with you on the business venture. Clara specializes in branding and Jack is our financial expert. Together, they'll help you get everything off the ground." Olivia nodded, trying to steady the nerves that were suddenly bubbling to the surface. These were professionals, real professionals. And though they were here to help her, she felt more exposed than ever. She wasn't just a mother trying to make ends meet anymore. She was now a businesswoman, with a team of people looking to her for answers. "Nice to meet you both," Olivia said, her voice sounding more confident than she felt. Clara gave her a warm smile, though Jack's face remained impassive. He didn't look at her the way Parker did, like there was something more he saw, something more he wanted. Jack's gaze was purely professional, but that too felt like another test. Parker stepped back, his hands folded in front of him. "You don't need to do everything right at first," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll guide you, but this will ultimately be your project. You'll have full control. That's the promise." "Thank you," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in this opportunity, but the weight of her doubts kept pulling her back. Clara and Jack began to speak, outlining the preliminary steps to building the business. Olivia listened, her mind drifting in and out of the conversation. She understood the basics, branding, marketing, and finances, but it was the emotional side of this venture that scared her. The vulnerability of trusting someone, trusting Parker, was the hardest part. Parker, sensing her unease, spoke again. "You don't have to make any decisions today, Olivia, but I'm here for you, every step of the way." The room fell silent for a moment, and Olivia met Parker's gaze. He wasn't just offering her a business, he was offering her a chance at something more. But could she trust him? Could she trust herself enough to take this leap? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about the future. Her future. And for the first time in a long while, that future felt possible. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of activity. Olivia met with Parker's team several times, absorbing the new world of business that she was being thrust into. She felt both empowered and overwhelmed by the responsibility now on her shoulders. There was the excitement of possibility, of something new, something she had always dreamed of. But there was also a growing fear that the stakes were higher than she had anticipated. The business they were developing was her chance at financial independence, a chance to build something that would not just benefit her, but also secure her children's future. But as the meetings progressed, so did the weight of the decision she had made. Parker had promised her control, but Olivia began to realize that the power dynamics were more complicated than she had imagined. Every time she sat down with Parker or his team, she couldn't shake the feeling that her choices were being subtly guided, that even as she made decisions, someone else was quietly pulling the strings. That realization gnawed at her every time she returned home. Each evening, after tucking Marcus and Sophia into bed, she found herself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, feeling the full weight of the life she was creating. Was it worth it? The question had become all-consuming. The business was progressing. Clara and Jack were both brilliant, professionals who had supported Olivia in every possible way, giving her confidence in her ability to succeed. But the emotional toll of working so closely with Parker, of letting him into her life, was more than she had anticipated. She had told herself from the beginning that this would be just business, that it was a transaction, pure and simple. Yet, the more time she spent with Parker, the more his presence began to blur those lines. It wasn't just the wealth that attracted her, or the undeniable chemistry that simmered between them. It was his quiet attentiveness, the way he seemed to understand her in ways no one else had. Yet, the more she allowed herself to lean into the growing connection between them, the more she feared losing control. The terms of their arrangement, after all, were clear. She had agreed to a year of companionship. Nothing more, nothing less. And in her heart, Olivia knew that she couldn't let herself fall for someone like Parker. He was too powerful, too distant, too consumed by his world of wealth and status. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with Parker about the direction of the business, Olivia found herself in her apartment, pacing the living room. The children were at a friend's house for a play date, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She felt conflicted. Parker had been incredibly generous with his support, but was that generosity truly selfless? Or was it another form of control? She had never been one to depend on anyone, especially not a man, and certainly not a man like Parker. And yet, there she was, caught between her desire for independence and the seductive pull of the life he could offer her. The sound of her phone vibrating on the counter broke her from her reverie. It was a message from Lisa. "I'm just checking in, Liv. You good?" She stared at the message for a moment, her mind racing. Lisa had been her sounding board through all of this, her best friend since childhood. Lisa had supported her through thick and thin. But Olivia knew her friend's concerns about the arrangement with Parker. It was hard for Lisa to understand why Olivia would put herself in a position like this, even with all the promises Parker had made. Lisa had always believed in Olivia's ability to make it on her own. Olivia quickly typed a response. "I'm fine, just thinking a lot. This whole thing is harder than I thought." A few seconds later, Lisa's reply popped up. "I know, but you're strong, Liv. Don't lose yourself in it. Stay grounded, okay?" Olivia's heart clenched. It was the support she needed, but it also reminded her of how far removed she had become from the woman she used to be. Could she really build something for herself without losing everything else? Was she truly becoming the person Parker wanted her to be? Or was she losing sight of who she really was in the process? Before she could respond, the sound of a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Parker standing on the other side, his posture casual, but his presence undeniably commanding. "Parker?" she asked, a bit surprised to see him. "What are you doing here? He gave her a small, wry smile. "I thought we should talk. About the business." Olivia's stomach tightened at the sight of him, though she quickly pushed the sensation away. "I thought we covered everything in the meeting today." "We did," he said, stepping past her into the apartment, his gaze sweeping over the familiar space. "But I want to make sure we're on the same page. I want to be sure you're still committed to this, Olivia. To us." She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy blanket. He was talking about the business, yes, but it was clear to her that he was talking about something more, something deeper. "I'm committed," she said quickly, trying to mask the conflict she was feeling. "But you have to understand, Parker, this isn't just about business for me. This is my life, and my children's lives." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I think you need to understand something too." He took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're not in this alone, and I'm not asking you to be." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She hadn't expected him to say that, to remind her that she wasn't alone, and yet the thought of depending on someone, of giving him that kind of power over her life, terrified her. It felt like a surrender, a sacrifice of her independence. "I'm not asking for you to give up everything you've worked for," Parker continued, his voice softening. "But I am offering you a chance to build something more, and I can help you get there, if you're willing to trust me." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with unspoken emotion. She could feel the pull of his gaze, the weight of his offer. But was she ready to let go of her fears, to let him into her life in a way that would change everything? Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could have both independence and the support he offered. But somewhere deep inside she feared that in accepting his help, she would lose herself. "I don't know if I can trust anyone completely again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Parker stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Then trust me, Olivia. Trust me with this. With us." The days following Parker's visit to her apartment had been a whirlwind of confusion and emotional unrest. Olivia found herself caught between her growing connection with him and the looming fear that by giving into it, she might lose herself, lose the very things that made her who she was. The walls she had spent years building were beginning to crumble, brick by brick, but she didn't know if she was ready to embrace the vulnerability Parker was asking of her. Parker had been patient, kind even, but his patience was beginning to feel like pressure. He had given her space after their conversation, allowing her to focus on the business. But as their meetings grew more frequent, so did the tension between them. He never pressed her, never pushed too hard. But Olivia knew that his quiet support was beginning to demand more than she was prepared to give. And the worst part was, she didn't know how to pull away. Every time they spoke, every time they shared a moment of unspoken connection, it felt like she was giving him a little piece of herself. Pieces that until recently, she hadn't even known she had. The morning of their next meeting, Olivia stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, adjusting her blouse as she tried to prepare herself for what lay ahead. She hadn't seen Parker since their last conversation, and though she had tried to focus on her work, a part of her couldn't shake the thought of him. She'd never imagined herself here, caught between ambition and desire, between independence and the pull of something deeper, something more intimate. She had spent years building a life for her children, creating a future for them that was as far removed from the struggles she had known as possible. But now, with Parker's offer dangling in front of her like a golden ticket, she wondered if everything she had worked for was about to be put to the test. The knock at the door startled her, and she quickly glanced at the clock. Parker was early, but that was nothing new. She hadn't fully prepared for his arrival, but then again she didn't think she ever truly could. "Olivia," he said when she opened the door, his smile warm but his eyes intense. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all," she replied, forcing a smile. She stepped aside to let him in, her stomach fluttering slightly as she felt the familiar weight of his presence in her apartment. His gaze swept over the modest space, pausing briefly as it took in the pictures of Marcus and Sophia on the mantelpiece, the scattered papers on the coffee table. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I can see the care you've put into this place." She nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's all for them," she said softly, glancing toward the living room where her children's toys were strewn across the floor. "Everything I do it for them." Parker's eyes lingered on her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "I admire that. You've been through a lot, and you're doing the best you can." She could feel the sincerity in his words, but they also felt like a subtle reminder that he could offer her more than what she had, more than what she had ever expected for herself. And that terrified her. "I'm ready to talk," she said, breaking the silence. "About the business." Parker gave her a knowing smile, then gestured toward the small table where they had worked before. "Let's sit down. I think we've made great progress, but today, I want to take it a step further. I want to talk about your role in this, what it means for you personally." As they sat, the air between them grew thicker, more charged. Olivia could feel the underlying tension, the unspoken truth that lay beneath every word. She knew he wanted more from her than just a business partner. But was she ready to give him more? Or was she simply playing into his world, becoming another piece in his carefully constructed empire? "Olivia," he began, his voice softer now, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, the part about being here for your children. You've built something incredible for them, and I respect that more than you know." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on hers. "But I want you to think about something else, too. About you. About the future you can build. Not just for them, but for yourself." She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. This was it. The moment where she had to decide whether she would follow the path that Parker was offering her, or continue down the one she had carved for herself. "I don't know if I can trust anyone with this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything. I've always done it on my own, Parker. I'm not sure I can just let go." His eyes softened, and for the first time since she had known him, Olivia saw something else in his gaze, something vulnerable. "I'm not asking you to let go of everything," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to trust that I'm not here to control you. I'm here because I believe in what you can do, Olivia. And I believe you deserve more than just surviving. You deserve to thrive." Her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was offering her something real, something beyond the confines of their arrangement. But the doubt that lingered in her mind, the fear of losing herself, made it difficult to let go. "Trust is hard for me," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly, "especially now. After everything, I've been hurt before, and I can't just forget that." Parker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back, his gaze never leaving hers. The room felt heavy with the weight of their conversation, the air thick with the unspoken truths between them. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to trust that this business, this opportunity, us, is different. You're not in this alone, Olivia. I'm here to help, but I can't help you if you don't let me." His words lingered in the air like a challenge, a promise. Olivia's heart raced as she grappled with the decision in front of her. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. If she said yes, if she chose to take that leap, it would change everything. But the question was she ready? Olivia sat on the edge of her bed that evening, her phone resting on her lap, the words from the last few hours echoing in her mind. She had been through so much in the past few months, trying to navigate this complex relationship with Parker, this business that was supposed to be her fresh start. And yet, with each step forward, she found herself slipping further into uncertainty. She had come so far, and yet each moment felt like it was hanging by a thread. The promise Parker had given her, the opportunity to finally build something on her own, had felt like a dream that she couldn't quite let herself believe. But now, the cracks were starting to show. In the past week, things had changed. The project had stalled, the initial excitement turning into long, exhausting meetings where Parker's calm demeanor was replaced by frustration. His once gentle encouragement now felt more like pressure. Was it always going to be like this? Olivia's thoughts were interrupted by a text message from Lisa. "Are you okay? I can hear it in your voice. You sound different." Olivia stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She hadn't been entirely honest with Lisa about how things were going with Parker. She didn't want to worry her friend, didn't want to admit that, despite the promises of independence, she was still drowning in the tension between her ambition and her growing feelings for Parker. "I don't know, Lisa. I'm trying to hold it together, but it's hard. Every day feels like another test, and sometimes I wonder if I'm just losing myself in this." The reply came almost immediately. "Don't lose yourself, Liv. You're strong, and you know your worth. Don't let anyone, especially him, make you forget that." She took a deep breath and set the phone aside, letting her eyes drift to the framed photos of Marcus and Sophia on her nightstand. They were her heart, her reason for everything she did. No matter how complicated her life had become, she knew that her love for them had to remain her anchor. She couldn't let this, whatever it was with Parker, derail everything she had fought for. But lately, Parker's presence felt suffocating. The business venture that was supposed to be her opportunity now felt more like a trap. Every decision, every move she made seemed to go through him, with his ideas and his vision leading the way. She had promised herself that she wouldn't become someone who relied on a man for her success, and yet, here she was, finding herself questioning every step she took. It was almost like the more Parker tried to support her, the more she felt the grip of his power tightening around her. And it wasn't just the business. It was everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her doorbell ringing. Olivia stood, surprised. Who could be here this late? Her heart skipped a beat when she glanced at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. She walked to the door, opening it to find Parker standing there, his expression tight, his features dark with something unreadable. "Parker?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence as commanding as ever. "Can we sit down?" Olivia felt a mix of emotions, reluctance, confusion, and a touch of fear, as she stepped back, allowing him to enter. Her apartment, with its modest furniture and family photos, felt like a stark contrast to the polished, sleek world Parker inhabited. But he didn't seem to notice the difference. He was focused on her, his gaze intense. "Olivia," he began, taking a seat at the small kitchen table, "I know things haven't been easy. I can tell you're feeling the pressure, but I'm here to help. You know that, right?" She folded her arms across her chest, standing a little straighter. "Help? I don't know anymore, Parker. I thought I could handle this, thought I could build something for myself. But it feels like you're pulling the strings. I don't want to be your project. I don't want to be anyone's project." Parker's eyes softened, though the intensity remained. This isn't about me trying to control you. I want to see you succeed. But I also need you to understand that I've invested in this because I believe in you. And I won't let you walk away from it just because it's difficult. Her heart hammered in her chest, the words hitting harder than she had expected. You won't let me walk away? I didn't ask you to invest in me, Parker, Olivia replied, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and hurt. I agreed to this because I thought it would be a way to provide for my kids, to do something real, something that wasn't just about surviving. But I feel like I'm losing myself in it. I feel like I'm losing control of everything I worked so hard for. Parker's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. He stood up, his tall frame filling the room. Olivia, I'm not trying to take control of your life. I'm here because I believe in you. But if you want to walk away from this, from me, then you need to be clear about it. The weight of his words landed heavily in the air between them. There it was, the ultimatum. Her heart raced as the tension grew. She had felt it building for days, this unspoken pressure, this unacknowledged conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface. Parker's desire to help, his need to see her succeed, was slowly morphing into a demand for her to give more than she was willing to. I can't, Olivia said, her voice hoarse as she turned away from him, her emotions rising like a tide she couldn't stop. I can't keep doing this. Not if it means losing myself. Parker stepped closer, his voice softening, though the edge of urgency remained. Olivia, please. You don't have to lose yourself in this. I can help you, but you have to trust me. Trust us. She shook her head, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore, Parker. I don't know if I can trust myself. Silence filled the space between them, thick with unspoken words and raw emotion. She felt his gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. You don't have to do this alone, Parker whispered, his voice almost pleading. You don't have to choose between your dreams and your family. We can figure this out together. Olivia's heart ached as she fought to keep her composure. She wasn't sure what she was asking for anymore, what she wanted from him, what she needed. But at that moment, she knew one thing for certain. The choice she made now would change everything. The question was, what kind of person would she be on the other side of it? The days after their heated argument felt like an eternity. Olivia spent most of her time alone in the apartment, turning the business proposal over and over in her mind, trying to decide if she could continue down this path. It felt as if the ground beneath her was constantly shifting, and every decision seemed to carry weight far heavier than she had anticipated. Parker had given her space, respecting her need for time to process their conversation. She had to admit that despite everything, there was a part of her that missed him. Not just his presence, but the way he made her feel like she was capable of more. But the truth was, she couldn't afford to lose herself in him. Not again. Every time she looked at her children, their innocent faces and the simple yet vital joys of their lives, she was reminded of the promises she had made to them. To them. They were her world. They were the only reason she had ever agreed to this arrangement, and she couldn't allow herself to forget that. She hadn't heard from Parker in a few days, which was exactly what she needed, but still, there was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind, an unsettling thought she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the business anymore. It was everything. The strange intimacy that had begun to develop between them was something Olivia didn't know how to handle. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to push it away or embrace it, but one thing was certain. She couldn't keep pretending like it didn't matter. That afternoon, as she was returning from picking up Sophia from school, her phone buzzed in her bag. It was a message from Lisa. "Call me when you get this." Olivia felt a twinge of worry. Lisa's texts were usually short, but this one felt urgent. She quickly dialed her best friend's number, praying that it wasn't bad news. "Liv?" Lisa's voice crackled through the phone, tinged with something Olivia couldn't quite place. "You need to sit down. I have something to tell you." Olivia's heart began to race. "What is it? What's going on?" There was a long pause before Lisa spoke again. "It's about Parker. I didn't want to say anything without being sure, but I think you should know." Olivia stopped in her tracks, her fingers gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean, about Parker?" she asked, her voice low. "What's happened?" Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if she were afraid to say it out loud. "I found something I think you need to know about him, Liv." Olivia's stomach twisted into knots. She had spent the last few months learning about Parker, his past, his world, his ambitions, but somehow she felt as if there was always something he was keeping from her. But what? "What did you find, Lisa?" Olivia asked, her voice thick with anxiety. "There's been a change in his business dealings, a big one. But it's not just that. Liv, I found out that he's been involved with someone else." Lisa's words hit Olivia like a punch to the chest. "I don't know the details, but I did some digging. There's another woman, someone from his past." For a moment, Olivia felt like the room was spinning around her. The cold air around her seemed to press in, suffocating her as the words echoed in her mind. "Another woman? How do you know this?" Olivia whispered, her throat tightening. "I have a contact in his industry," Lisa replied, her voice still hushed. "They told me he's been meeting with someone close to him, and it's not just business. Liv, I think you should be careful." Olivia stood frozen, her hand gripping the phone as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. She hadn't expected this. Not now. Not when everything had felt like it was finally falling into place. Another woman? Her mind spun as the implications of Lisa's words crashed over her. She had already suspected that Parker wasn't entirely forthcoming with her, but this was different. This felt like a betrayal. "Liv, are you still there?" Lisa's voice brought her back to the present. "You need to think about this before you go any further with him. I don't want to see you hurt." Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she took a shaky breath. "I don't know what to think right now, Lisa, I don't. But I have to know. I have to find out if this is true." As the call ended, Olivia stood there stunned, her body trembling. It felt as though the ground beneath her had given way. She needed to confront Parker. She needed to know the truth. But what if it shattered everything she had built? The next evening, Olivia stood at the door of Parker's penthouse, her hand hovering over the doorbell. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with a million questions. She had to know. Was he hiding something from her? Was he really seeing someone else? She pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing Parker standing there, his dark eyes unreadable as he looked down at her. His expression faltered slightly when he saw her face, his features softening. "Olivia?" he said, his voice low and concerned. "What's wrong?" Her stomach twisted. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice strained. "About the woman I've heard about." Parker's eyes narrowed slightly, the calm composure he usually wore starting to slip. "What woman?" he asked, though there was a hint of wariness in his tone. "The woman you've been seeing?" Olivia pressed, her voice trembling. "I know there's someone else. I need to know the truth, Parker." For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze flickered to the side as though considering whether to answer. Then he stepped aside, silently inviting her in. Olivia hesitated, but then stepped inside. "Olivia, Parker began, but she cut him off. "Who is she?" Olivia asked, her voice shaking. Why didn't you tell me about her? Why did you let me think it was just business?" Parker closed his eyes for a moment, his face hardening. "It's not what you think, Olivia." Olivia felt her chest constrict. "Then what is it, Parker? What's going on? Tell me the truth, please." He took a deep breath, then looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "The truth is that I've been trying to keep you at arm's length. I never meant for things to get so complicated." Her pulse raced as the words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Keep her at arm's length?" "I've been trying to protect you," he continued, his voice low and strained. "I didn't want you to get too close. Not because of her, because of me." Olivia felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "Protect her? What do you mean, Parker?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But as the truth began to unfold, Olivia realized that everything she had built her life around was now in danger of being destroyed. The silence between them stretched like an endless chasm. Parker stood across from Olivia, his face a mixture of tension and regret, while she felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over her. She had come here for answers, had demanded the truth, and now that it was staring her in the face, she wasn't sure how to process it. "Protect me?" Olivia echoed, the words feeling like sandpaper against her tongue. "You've been keeping secrets from me because you were trying to protect me?" Parker's jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly. "It wasn't supposed to go this far, Olivia. This wasn't part of the plan. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't want you to get involved in my mess." Her pulse quickened. His words sounded like half a confession, like something more was lurking just beneath the surface. "What mess?" she demanded. "What's going on, Parker? Who is she? And why didn't you tell me about her?" He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flashing with frustration. "It's complicated. You have to understand it's not simple. This thing with you, it's not just business anymore. And I've been trying to hold on to some control over this, over us." Olivia shook her head, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and confusion. "I thought we were honest with each other," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought this arrangement was about trust, Parker. But you've been lying to me from the start." Parker took a step closer, his voice low, earnest. "I never lied to you, Olivia. I didn't know how to tell you. There's a lot of things I haven't shared, things I wasn't ready to confront. I didn't want to drag you into them." "You think I can't handle the truth?" Olivia's voice was sharp, but there was an underlying vulnerability to it that she couldn't hide. She felt exposed in ways she hadn't expected, as if the foundation of everything she thought she knew about herself and about Parker was now crumbling. Parker's gaze softened, and for the first time, Olivia saw a flicker of something beyond the billionaire persona, the calculating man who controlled everything. "It's not about whether you can handle it," he said quietly. "It's about me, about my past, about the things I've been running from." He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. "There's a woman, Sophia. She's someone I was involved with years ago, and she's been trying to get back into my life, into my business. She has ties to my company, to some of the projects I've been involved in. And I didn't want you to be dragged into it. I didn't want her to cause problems for you. For us." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut. Sophia. The name had a weight to it, a history that Parker hadn't shared with her until now. The more he spoke, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. But they formed a picture she wasn't ready to see. "You should have told me," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand that you have a past, Parker. We all do. But you don't get to decide what I can handle. I'm not some fragile thing you need to protect." I never thought of you like that, Parker said quickly, stepping closer to her, his eyes pleading. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to pull you into something that could destroy everything we've built. I know I should have told you sooner, but I thought I could fix it. I thought I could keep it under control. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. So what now? Olivia asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. What am I supposed to do with this information? You've been keeping this secret, Parker. You've been keeping her a secret. The silence that followed was thick with unresolved tension. Olivia's mind raced, trying to process everything that Parker had just revealed. She felt betrayed, but beneath the betrayal there was something else, something deeper, a connection, a fragile thread that she hadn't yet acknowledged, one that had been pulling her in despite her best efforts to resist. Parker's face softened as he reached out to her, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, Olivia. I should have trusted you with this. I shouldn't have kept you in the dark. Olivia felt the warmth of his hand on her arm, but she couldn't allow herself to lean into it. You don't get to apologize and expect everything to be okay, Parker, she said, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and hurt. You've been hiding things from me, things that matter. You can't just tell me about her and expect me to move on like it's nothing. He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. You're right. I should have been more honest. But I was afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing everything I've worked for. Olivia met his gaze, her chest tightening. This isn't just about business, is it? It's about us. You've been trying to keep me at arm's length, trying to control everything. And now I don't know who you are anymore. Parker stepped closer, his voice pleading. Olivia, please. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we have. But I've been dealing with things that I didn't know how to share. And I can't change the past. But I can change how I handle the future. Our future. Her heart wavered as she stared at him, torn between the man she was beginning to care for and the man who had just torn down the walls she had built around herself. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe in them. But something deep inside her screamed that the walls she had put up weren't just for protection. They were a reminder of the strength she had built, the strength she couldn't afford to lose. I don't know, Parker, Olivia said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. A silence stretched between them as Parker stood there, motionless, his face a mixture of regret and determination. And in that moment, Olivia realized that the hardest decision was not whether she could trust him, but whether she could trust herself to move forward, no matter the cost. The air between Olivia and Parker was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the apartment. Olivia stood by the window, staring out at the city lights below, trying to steady her breath. She had spent the last few days torn between the life Parker had offered her and the life she had worked so hard to build for herself. Each step forward felt like a step further into a world that was no longer hers, and the uncertainty of it all was suffocating. Parker had promised he wasn't trying to control her, that he only wanted what was best for her and for their future. But the more he revealed about his past, the more she saw how much she didn't know about him. She had always been fiercely independent. Her children, her work, her dreams had been her sole focus, and for the first time in a long time, she was afraid that if she took another step forward with Parker, she might lose herself in the process. The past few days had been filled with sleepless nights and endless, quiet reflection. Every time she looked at her children, she was reminded of why she had agreed to this arrangement in the first place. They were her heart, her everything. But the question kept eating away at her. Was she still doing this for them? Or was it because she was afraid of facing the life she had built without Parker's support? The sound of a soft knock on the door startled her. She hadn't expected him to come back so soon, but the sound of his voice from the other side made her chest tighten. "Olivia?" His voice was low, hesitant. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, but in the end she opened the door. There he was, standing in the hallway, his face unreadable, but the storm in his eyes spoke volumes. He looked tired, worn out from the same internal battle she had been facing. But despite everything, he was here. He always seemed to come back even when things were at their most complicated. "Parker," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended. "I didn't expect you. I thought we—" "I know," he interrupted softly. "But I need you to know that I'm not asking for you to decide everything right now. I need to talk to you, Olivia. I need to tell you how I feel, what I've been holding back." Olivia stepped aside to let him in, her heart pounding in her chest. Every inch of her body screamed to protect herself, to lock away her heart and keep it safe. But the connection between them, the undeniable pull, was hard to ignore. She couldn't pretend that he didn't matter, that what they had wasn't real. "I know you have questions, and I know that everything feels out of control right now," Parker said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stood in the middle of the small living room. "But I need you to understand that I didn't come into this with any intention of hurting you. I thought I could keep everything separate, keep you separate from the chaos of my life. But I was wrong." Olivia met his gaze, feeling the heat of his words seep into her chest. "Parker, you've been hiding things from me. You've kept secrets, and it's like everything we've built has been built on a lie. I don't know what to think anymore." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've been selfish in the way I've handled things. But you need to know, Olivia, that the one thing I've never lied about is how much I care about you, how much I want this to work." Her breath hitched at the sincerity in his voice, and for a moment she found herself wondering if she had been too hard on him. She had kept so many walls up, kept herself locked in this cage of independence, that she had missed the possibility of something real. But now everything felt so complicated, so dangerous. "I want to believe you," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. "I want to believe that this is real, that we are real. But I don't know if I can do this anymore. I can't keep fighting with myself, trying to figure out if you're the man I need, or if you're just a reflection of the life I've been running from." Parker's face softened, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability he had hidden behind his carefully crafted exterior. "I don't want to be something you're running from, Olivia. I'm not perfect, but I'm not asking you to be perfect either. I'm asking for a chance, for us to figure this out together." She took a step back, feeling the weight of his words press against her chest. Could she let him in? Could she let herself trust him, knowing what it could cost her? "I've spent my whole life making sure that I don't need anyone," Olivia said, her voice quiet and distant. "I've spent years protecting myself from people like you, from men who say they can make things better, but only end up pulling me into their world until I can't breathe." Parker's expression faltered as he reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. "I don't want to pull you into my world, Olivia. I want to build something with you, something that's ours, something that's real." She looked down at their hands, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. His words, his sincerity, made everything feel like it was shifting. She had spent so long afraid of losing herself, of being overwhelmed by the weight of someone else's expectations. But now, she realized something crucial. This wasn't just about him or her. This was about the two of them, deciding to step forward into something that could change everything. "Why didn't you tell me about Sophia?" she asked quietly, her eyes finally meeting his. Why did you keep her a secret?" He let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping. "Because I thought it was over. I thought I had closed that chapter of my life. But she's been trying to get back into my business for months, and I didn't want you to think that I was still tied to her. But the truth is I wasn't being fair to you by hiding it." Olivia's heart clenched at his confession, and for the first time she truly felt like she understood the depth of his struggle. This wasn't about her. It was about him trying to protect her from his past. But in doing so, he had built another wall between them. "I don't need you to protect me, Parker," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "I just need you to be honest, to trust me the way I've trusted you." Parker stepped closer, his face inches from hers. His eyes searched hers as if looking for some sign that she was ready to take the leap with him. "Olivia," he said softly, "I'm ready." "Are you?" The room felt charged with the weight of the moment. The silence stretched, heavy with the possibility of what was to come. Olivia felt her walls, her defenses begin to crumble. She had spent so long hiding from the truth, hiding from the possibility of something more. But now, as she looked at Parker, she knew that the time had come for her to make a choice, to step forward, to trust, to take the risk. "Yes," she whispered, her heart racing as she whispered the words that would change everything. "Yes, I'm ready." The days after Olivia made her decision felt like a rush of relief mixed with a healthy dose of fear. She had chosen to trust Parker, to step into a future that had been fraught with hesitation and uncertainty. But with that decision came a profound shift, one that altered everything about how she saw herself and her relationship with him. For the first time in months, Olivia found herself walking through the city with a different kind of energy. It wasn't just the business that had begun to take shape, though that was a big part of it. It was something deeper, a change in herself. The walls that had once felt so necessary were now crumbling piece by piece as she let go of the fear that had ruled her life for so long. But the change was not without its challenges. Every day Olivia faced a new set of obstacles. The business was growing, thanks to the help of Parker's team, but there were moments when she wondered if it was all too much. Could she truly handle it? Could she handle him? Parker was different now, too. Since their conversation, he had softened. He still held on to that quiet power. But there was something else there, something that made him seem more vulnerable, more human. He wasn't the distant, calculating man she had first met. And though she found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't expected, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Would she lose herself in him? Could she trust that this wasn't just another thing he was controlling, another piece of his world that she had to adapt to? The answers weren't clear, but she wasn't running from the questions anymore. She was ready to face them head on. It was late afternoon when Parker called. Olivia had just finished a meeting with Clara and Jack about a new marketing initiative for the business and was feeling the usual mix of accomplishment and exhaustion. She had planned to spend the evening with Marcus and Sophia, but she knew from the moment she saw his name on the caller ID that plans would change. "Hey," she said, answering the phone as she walked out of her apartment. "What's up?" "I was hoping you could meet me at the office," Parker's voice came through, smooth as always, but with a slight undertone of urgency. "There's something important we need to discuss." Olivia's brow furrowed. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah. It's just, I think it's time we talk about the next step." Her heart skipped. The next step. She had been waiting for this moment, though part of her had been hoping it wouldn't come so soon. The decision to fully commit to the business, to Parker, felt like it carried immense weight. She had allowed herself to get comfortable with their partnership, with his help. But now she was beginning to realize that the next step would require more than just business decisions. "I'll be there in 15, Olivia said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She hung up, trying to suppress the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. When Olivia arrived at the sleek office building, she was greeted by the usual efficiency of Parker's team. Clara waved from across the room, her smile warm but focused, while Jack nodded in acknowledgement. But Olivia could tell that something was different. There was a tense energy in the air, something unspoken that seemed to hang in the space between them. She walked into Parker's office, finding him standing by the large windows, looking out at the sprawling city beneath them. His back was to her, but he turned as she entered, offering her a small, tight smile. "Olivia," he said, his voice steady but with a layer of something deeper beneath it. "I'm glad you're here." She nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her chest. "You said we needed to talk?" Parker motioned to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." She did, watching him carefully as he took a seat across from her, the weight of the moment settling between them. The soft hum of the city outside seemed distant, muted by the tension in the room. "I've been thinking a lot," Parker began, his eyes locked on hers. "About us, about where we're going with the business, with everything. And I think it's time we take the next step, Olivia." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I think it's time you take full control of the company," he said, his voice steady but laden with expectation. "You've proven yourself, Olivia. You've worked harder than I ever could have expected, and I believe you're ready for this. I want you to lead it, not just as a partner, but as the head of it." Olivia's heart raced, the enormity of his words hitting her all at once. Lead it? The thought of taking full control of the business was overwhelming and thrilling. She had dreamed of this, of standing on her own, of building something that was truly hers. But the idea of being in charge, of stepping into the role that Parker was offering her, filled her with both excitement and doubt. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "Absolutely," Parker replied. "I know we've worked together up until now, but I think you're ready for this. I've seen how you've grown, how you've handled everything we've thrown at you. You're more than capable." Olivia swallowed, her thoughts racing. "This is what I've wanted," she reminded herself. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to prove to herself and to everyone else that she could do it on her own. But there was another part of her that hesitated. This wasn't just about business. This was about her relationship with Parker. And once she took that step, once she agreed to lead this company, everything would change. But was she ready for that kind of responsibility? Could she truly embrace this future with him by her side, as her partner, but also as someone who had been pulling the strings all along? "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to. I want to lead. But it feels like a lot." Parker leaned forward, his expression softening. "I know it's a lot. But you're not doing this alone, Olivia. You've built a team. You've earned this, and I'm here to support you, every step of the way." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. And for the first time, she felt the weight of the decision become a little lighter. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm now, a new determination settling into her chest. "Let's do this." Parker smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Olivia." And in that moment, as she took the first step toward the future, she realized that she wasn't just stepping into a new chapter of her career. She was stepping into a future where she could finally have it all: her business, her children, and maybe, just maybe, a life with Parker that was built on trust, not control. The final days of the year were fast approaching, and with them came a sense of quiet triumph that Olivia hadn't expected. A triumph that wasn't just tied to the business, though that was a monumental accomplishment in itself. It was the feeling that she had come into her own, truly into her own. She was no longer just a single mother trying to make ends meet. She wasn't just a partner in a business venture that had once felt so foreign to her. She was the head of her own empire, a woman who had fought for her place and earned it. The office had changed in the last few months. What had once been a nerve-wracking, overwhelming space now felt like hers. Every decision, every meeting, every success and failure was her own. Clara and Jack still worked with her, of course, but they were no longer the guiding forces. Olivia had stepped into that role, leading her team with grace and authority, and the company, though still young, was thriving under her leadership. But even with all of the business success, it was the change in her heart that had made the biggest impact. She had spent so much of her life running from the vulnerability that came with love, but in choosing to trust Parker, she had found something she never thought possible: a balance. She had learned to love without losing herself, and that, more than anything else, had been the most powerful transformation of all. Parker had been by her side throughout it all. He had stepped back, allowing her to grow into her role as CEO, and he had respected her autonomy. His presence had shifted from a constant source of tension to a quiet support, a partnership that felt more natural as the days passed. The dynamic between them had changed, not because of what they had built together, but because of what they had each been willing to give up in order to be together. Their love wasn't the kind that consumed everything. It was a love that had grown organically, piece by piece. It was steady. It was real. And it was full of understanding. They had both learned to trust, not just each other, but themselves. On this particular evening, as the final meeting of the year wrapped up, Olivia found herself standing by the window in her office, looking out at the city lights below. The glow of the skyline felt like a promise, one she had built for herself, with no one's help but her own. But as she stood there, gazing out at the city, she realized that there was one piece of this puzzle still left incomplete. She turned, glancing at the door as it opened softly behind her. Parker walked in, his usual quiet confidence accompanying his every step. He didn't speak right away, but he didn't need to. He had always known when Olivia needed time to reflect. He just stood there for a moment, watching her. "You're thinking about the future again," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. She smiled, a gentle curve of her lips. "Yes," she replied, "but this time it's not about the business or the next big project. It's about us, about what comes next for us." Parker stepped forward, his gaze softening. "What comes next for us?" he echoed. There was a pause between them, one filled with years of unspoken understanding. "I think I know what that is." Olivia raised an eyebrow, a hint of playfulness creeping into her expression. "You do?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "Yes. We've both built our lives separately. You've built a career you can be proud of, and I've spent years building my empire. But there's one thing we haven't done yet." She waited, feeling the weight of his words. "We haven't built a life together," he continued, his voice steady. "A life that's just ours, not business, not expectations. Just us." Olivia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had longed for but never allowed herself to fully experience. Just us. It had always been so hard to imagine a future with someone without losing herself in the process. But now, standing here with Parker, she realized that she didn't have to lose anything. She didn't have to choose between her independence and love. She could have both. "That's what I want too," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I don't want to just be a partner in business anymore. I want to be a partner in life, with you." Parker's smile widened, and for the first time, Olivia saw a sense of peace in his expression, something he had never shown before. "Then let's do that. Let's build something real together." The following months were a whirlwind of new beginnings. Olivia and Parker began to weave their lives together in ways that felt natural and full of promise. They spent weekends with Marcus and Sophia, their families blending together as seamlessly as Olivia had always hoped for. Her children had grown fond of Parker, and while the transition had been difficult at times, Olivia could see the strength of the bond between them growing stronger each day. Her business continued to flourish, and while Parker remained a quiet, supportive figure in the background, he was no longer the driving force of her success. He had given her the space to shine, to step into the leadership role she had always dreamed of. And when it came to their relationship, there was no longer any uncertainty. Olivia knew that she had found something real, something built on mutual respect, trust, and love. They had built their connection from the ground up, each of them contributing in their own way, without fear of losing themselves in the process. One evening, as they sat together on the couch in their apartment, Marcus and Sophia asleep in their rooms, Parker turned to Olivia, his eyes filled with affection. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "Not just for everything you've achieved, but for the person you've become, the person I'm lucky enough to share my life with." Olivia smiled, her heart full. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" He nodded, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "We have, and I wouldn't change a thing." In that moment, Olivia knew with certainty that she had found the balance she had always been searching for, a balance between love, ambition, and personal growth. She had built something of her own, but she had also built a life with Parker that was just as strong, just as fulfilling. As she rested her head on his shoulder, the city lights twinkling outside, Olivia realized that she had finally found her place, not in the world of wealth and power, but in the quiet, steady love she had always deserved. And it was enough.